and distinguished committee subcommittee members. My name is Henry Schennebeck, and I appear before you today representing the American Loggers Council based in Gilbert, Minnesota, as chair of the Government Relations Committee. ALC is a national trade organization providing exclusive representation for timber harvesting and hauling businesses across the United States. I report today that the impact of COVID-19 is severe enough that for the first time in my lifelong history as a logger, timber harvesters and haulers found it necessary to ask the federal government for financial assistance. Except for toilet paper, tissue paper, face masks, paper gown products, the forest products manufacturing, including sawmill, building material manufacturers, and printing paper producers drastically curtailed or stopped production at the beginning of the pandemic. While we are thankful the federal government determined timber harvesting and hauling to be essential, it is understandable that with stay-at-home orders, product demand was unpredictable, which had an immediate negative impact on industry's ability to purchase raw material produced by timber harvesters. As the pandemic evolved, the appetite for homeowners to implement do-it-yourself projects increased sharply and demand for building materials skyrocketed. Contrary to what many believe, timber harvesters and haulers have not benefited from the record high finished product prices. This is especially true for Michigan, Minnesota, Wisconsin, where wood consumers have closed their doors because of COVID, causing an overabundance of raw material. It became a supply and demand market on both the raw material end and the finished product side of manufacturing. It is important to understand that, like farmers, these small family-owned and operated logging and timber hauling businesses are capital intensive and generate income only when product is delivered to market. Reduced prices for raw material, coupled with increased operational costs, particularly fuel, has resulted in a 10 to 40% loss in revenue for many companies compared to the same 2019 timeframe. Proof of an approximately $1.8 billion loss in revenue is supported with multiple studies and surveys, which are included in the full testimony. The ALC survey showed 61% of loggers received financial help from the Paycheck Protection Plan. Timber harvesters and haulers are very appreciative of having PPP funds available, and their lenders are as well. Without additional COVID relief, these generational businesses will continue struggling financially to survive. If they fail, the nation will be hard pressed to find individuals willing to make the investments required to keep wood fiber supplied to manufacturers of products we all use daily. The Consolidated Appropriations Act allows the Department of Agriculture to provide up to $200 million in assistance for timber harvesting and hauling businesses. Through no fault of their own, the Farm Service Agency has no experience in dealing with timber harvesters and haulers. USDA and the Forest Service and FSA worked diligently to make these funds available, which happened yesterday, as was pointed out, and we greatly appreciate their efforts. In addition to clean air, healthy forests provide clean water, wildlife habitat, and generate billions of dollars worth of well-paying forest industry jobs in rural America. Healthy forest and healthy forest industry go hand in hand. One cannot effectively exist without the other. Post-pandemic economic recovery is challenged logistically by limited transportation capacity. The ALC continues advocating for safer, more efficient transportation with the introduction of the Safe Routes Act. This legislation will allow states to authorize truck weights on the federal interstate equal to state-approved local road weight limits. The timber industry grows and harvests trees just like other agricultural commodities. Recognizing the timber industry as agriculture would provide silviculture parity with agriculture. To maintain and improve America's forests for maximum social benefit, including climate change, sequestration of carbon, support of rural economies and recreation, sustainable forest management must continue to improve. Forest management is possible only with a secure professional logging workforce. In addition, recognizing new technologies like laminated and cross-laminated timber and biofuels industry will promote investment in facilities to use wood and produce new value-added products. These recommendations will have minimal fiscal impact and are simply policy and legislative changes to support climate change initiatives, reduce fossil fuel consumption, improve forest health, and contribute significantly to post-COVID-19 wood products industry recovery. With that, I'll end my testimony.
Thank you very much, Mr. Schinnebeck, and certainly working frequently with the Virginia Loggers Association, as I do. Some of the comments you made I thought were particularly impactful. Certainly what we've heard on the ground relates back to the fact that with the rise in price in timber products, so many of our timber haulers and foresters did not see the benefit there. So thank you for making sure that that was an essential part of your opening statement. Ms. Dozet, you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairwoman Spanberger, Ranking Member LaMalfa, and members of the committee, thank you for holding this hearing and for your continued work to support the forest products industry. I am Caroline Dozet, a fourth-generation owner of Rex Lumber, which operates 4 Southern Yellow Pine sawmills. I am also a member of the Southeastern Lumber Manufacturers Association, which represents mills, lumber treaters, and their suppliers throughout the Southeast. Additionally, I chair the Softwood Lumber Board. My family has been in the lumber industry since the early 1900s. Rex Lumber Company was founded by my great-grandfather, W.D. McRae, in 1926 in Graceville, Florida. Through years of hard work and dedication, our sawmills now employ more than 650 hardworking men and women, while on track to produce over 800 million board feet of lumber per year in 2022. In addition to lumber, we own a pole and piling manufacturer, land management company, and trucking operation. In total, we employ 715 individuals. We also own timberland in Florida, Georgia, and Alabama. Like the rest of the world, the pandemic and market volatility took us by surprise. Our mills were at maximum production before COVID. When the pandemic hit, we implemented strict safety protocols, and COVID infections within our company were not widespread. We were able to utilize the tax credits made available in the COVID relief package to offset the cost of providing for our employees and their families that were impacted by the virus. Our smaller trucking company, procurement, and pole companies were also able to participate in the PPP loan program. The lumber industry received essential status and the market rebounded quickly. Rex Lumber was able to produce 689 million board feet from June of 2020 to May of 2021, compared to 575 million board feet over the same period in the prior year. That's an increase in production of 20%. As a whole, the North American lumber industry increased production by 1.4 billion board feet last year. Most of this growth was in the South, where production increased 1.1 billion board feet, marking a 5% increase over 2019. With housing starts being depressed over the past decade, the pandemic ushered in skyrocketing demand for new homes, renovations, and DIY projects, outpacing production. Sawmills have continued to manufacture lumber as quickly as possible to meet demand. However, we are constrained by manufacturing infrastructure as 36 southern sawmills disappeared during the Great Recession. In fact, production of southern pine did not return to the previous peak of 19 billion board feet in 2005 until 2019. Construction of new mills is impeded by the availability of sawmill machinery, and while we understand the importance of protecting air and water quality, the permitting process can be lengthy. For example, the Rex Lumber Mill in Troy, Alabama, which employs 175 people, broke ground in 2018 and will not meet our full production target of 300 million board feet annually until next year. Throughout the South, projects currently underway are expected to increase production more than 2 billion board feet over the next 2 to 3 years. This will increase the supply of lumber in the long term while creating more markets for timberland owners. Short term, our primary constraints are workforce and transportation shortages. While residential construction has been and will continue to be a major portion of our customer base, the industry is looking for ways to diversify our markets to lessen the impact on sawmill infrastructure when the next recession hits. Specifically, we are working to increase the use of mass timber for non-residential and larger multifamily housing construction projects. In addition to diversifying the domestic lumber market, utilizing more wood through mass timber also locks up carbon in the built environment. This expands markets for landowners that produce trees for the benefit of society and the environment, but most importantly, creates and sustains good-paying jobs in our rural communities. The government can encourage increased utilization of wood products by supporting the U.S. Forest Products Lab to continue valuable research for current and new wood products. Additionally, increased utilization in government projects such as those managed by the General Services Administration and the Department of Defense not only expands mass timber markets directly, but also enhances awareness and acceptance of these innovative pro-environment products in the commercial markets. In conclusion, while volatility within the markets continues to be difficult for lumber producers and consumers, sawmills remain drivers in rural economies while providing opportunities to meet society's demand for reduced carbon emissions. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to taking your questions.
Thank you so very much, Ms. Dosette, for your opening testimony. And Mr. Urbagamo, please begin whenever you are ready. And welcome back to the Agriculture Committee.
Thank you, Chairwoman Spanberger. Happy to be here. And Ranking Member LaMalfa and Chairwoman Spanberger, thanks for the opportunity to speak to you today about the public lands timber industry and our experience in the pandemic and as the economy has continued to recover. Our industry weathered the pandemic with remarkable resilience. And at the outset, lumber prices fell further in a few weeks than they did during the entirety of the Great Recession in 2007 to 2009. Mills reacted by reducing production, dropping shifts, and in some cases, closing entirely. As members of the committee know, however, demand for wood products rapidly rebounded as the DIY market and housing starts picked up steam. Prices climbed to record highs in early May of this year, but since then, lumber prices are down more than 65%, proving that the laws of supply and demand remain very much in effect. I want to be clear, the Forest Service is to be commended for their efforts to continue delivering timber sales during 2020. They took steps to quickly provide contract extensions and other flexibility when the market collapsed, and then delivered a $3.2 billion board foot timber sale program during the pandemic and a historically bad fire year. While this is amongst the highest levels sold in over 2 decades, this still represents less than half the allowable sale quantity identified in current forest plans. As the market for solid wood products has remained strong, however, the Forest Service timber sale program has not kept pace. At the end of the second quarter of this fiscal year, timber sales from the National Forest were down 19% compared to the same quarter last year. Modest efforts to salvage burned wood from last year's fires has been limited by the threat of litigation, and this includes even just modest roadside hazard tree removal. Many forests that burned in 2020 will convert to brush fields if they are not harvested and replanted. Brush fields are more susceptible to future fires and do not sequester carbon the way healthy growing forests do. Salvaging burned timber would store carbon in long-lasting wood products while generating revenues to pay reforestation costs. Since the 1990s, the Forest Service has presumed that sensitive species, grizzly bears, spotted owls, and others, need closed canopy, high density forests in order to survive. We reduced harvests by more than 80% across the National Forest System as a result. We've had more than 20 years to see the results, and they are not pretty. As harvests have dropped, wildfires have increased. Overstocked national forests have succumbed to fires driven by drought, climate change, and insects. Communities have been decimated as mills, which serve as economic engines, were forced to shutter. The benefits we were told to expect from tourism, healthier watersheds, and improved wildlife habitat have not materialized either. Over 360,000 acres of northern spotted owl habitat were destroyed by catastrophic fire in Oregon last year alone, and there was more in California and Washington as well. We've seen similar destruction in grizzly bear habitat in Montana. Sometimes national forests simply fail to offer sufficient timber for sale, regardless of whether there's a species of concern on the forest. This threatens nearby mills and the blue-collar jobs they provide. Just this year, one of my member companies, Nyman Enterprises, was forced to shutter their mill in Hill City, South Dakota, after the Black Hills National Forest failed to meet its timber target for 3 consecutive years. Over 120 people in the small town of just over 1,000 are now out of work, and the ability to manage the Black Hills has been permanently reduced. Given the widespread forest health and wildfire crisis we're seeing on our national forest, we'd hope that at the very least the agency would not reduce their current timber sale levels. Loss of mill capacity permanently reduces the ability of the Forest Service to manage forests and drives up land management costs. Congress has enacted numerous streamlined authorities to get management done and has more than doubled the hazardous fuel budget since 2005. Many of the authorities originated in this committee, including key provisions adopted in the 2014 and 2018 Farm Bills. We urge Congress to treat our national forests as critical green infrastructure and invest further increases in management, focusing on mechanical thinning and harvest, as well as cooperative approaches like Good Neighbor Authority. The funding in the Bipartisan Outdoor Restoration Partnership Act would be a good start on this investment. The threat of litigation remains a significant burden on the Forest Service. Congress must address the extremely disruptive cottonwood precedent, which the Obama administration fought all the way to the Supreme Court. That one precedent has led to over 400 million board feet being tied up in litigation in one region alone. That's enough to build 24,000 houses. The Forest Service should also plan in advance how it's going to help national forests recover from increasingly frequent and therefore increasingly predictable disturbances like wildfires and hurricanes. While a few forests have taken steps to prepare in advance for salvage and recovery efforts, Congress can provide clear support and direction that will help these steps stand up in court. I have other specific recommendations in my testimony, and I appreciate the opportunity to share these thoughts with you today. Look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. And Mr. McDonald, could you please begin your testimony when you are ready?
Chair Spanberger, Ranking Member Ramalfa, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. My name is Ian McDonald. I serve as the director of the Tallwood Design Institute, collaboration between the Colleges of Forestry and Engineering at Oregon State University and the College of Design at the University of Oregon. We carry out applied research, education, product development, and testing for designers, builders, and manufacturers. Much of our work focuses on a new breed of engineered wood products known as mass timber. In my testimony today, I'll focus my comments on the role of wood as a tool to sustainably rebuild our infrastructure and economy. The capacity to process wood into mass timber with reliable and predictable performance is facilitating a sea change in sustainable construction around the world. Mass timber is precision engineered and robotically fabricated. This enables wood, which has typically been restricted to single-family homes and low-rise multifamily structures, to be used in buildings that are larger and taller than ever before. In 2015, with support from researchers at OSU, Oregon was the first state to produce cross-laminated timber panels certified for use in buildings. As a result, Oregon became home to many of the nation's earliest mass timber buildings and a vibrant cohort of pioneering architects, engineers, and construction firms with expertise that's now in demand across the country. Nationwide, the rate of adoption of mass timber has been dramatic. In 2013, there were less than 5 construction projects started. As of June 2021, 1,169 mass timber buildings had been constructed or were in design, with projects in all 50 states. Manufacturing capacity has expanded in lockstep from just 1 US production facility in 2015 to 9 today. All these are bringing back high-value jobs to rural communities from Washington to Alabama. But these buildings still represent only 5 million of the 93 billion square feet of US commercial building space. In addition to the economic impacts, there are carbon reduction benefits from expanding wood construction, as we've heard. Currently, 40% of US greenhouse gas emissions are derived from buildings. We can improve their thermal efficiency to reduce the energy needed for heating and cooling, but this alone will be insufficient to achieve the steep reductions we need in carbon. Manufacturing processes for timber products have a much lower carbon footprint than those for concrete and steel. Timber products sequester carbon for the building's lifetime and can be recycled and given a second life afterward. And lighter wood structures mean that less concrete is needed in the foundations. It all adds up to a ready-made formula for reducing our carbon emissions by doing what we already plan to do, modernize and improve our physical infrastructure. Mass timber can help our nation rebuild in other ways too. 2 innovative Oregon projects are embracing the use of underutilized species and restoration timber to tackle the housing crisis. They aim to design kit of parts housing systems using domestic timber that can be prefabricated at high volumes and low unit cost for communities in need, whether these are urban centers addressing homelessness rural communities ravaged by fire or other natural disasters, or working families caught in the missing middle who cannot afford to own homes. Research has played a key role in driving innovation, showing us that mass timber buildings can deliver fire and seismic safety on par with any concrete or steel structure. Further work is critical, however, to help our industry drive down costs, optimize fiber use, and allow mass timber to be implemented on a broader scale. The USDA Agricultural Research Service, the Forest Products Lab, and the US Forest Service have been invaluable partners for our research. The leadership and financial contributions of these agencies have been matched 200% by state and private sector support, and industry has worked hand in hand with us. To fully realize the enormous potential of timber construction, I offer these recommendations. First, continue and expand the support to USDA ARS, the Forest Products Laboratory, and the Wood Innovations Program for this important applied work. Second, facilitate support for workforce training and development. This is critical for the successful growth of the manufacturing base. Lastly, I would encourage the subcommittee to consider opportunities for incentivizing the use of domestically produced low-carbon building materials at federal, state, and municipal levels. In closing, thank you for the opportunity to testify today, and I would welcome the opportunity to answer any questions.
At this time, members will be recognized for questions in order of seniority, alternating between majority and minority members. The ranking member and I would like to recognize the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Thompson, if he'd like to begin with asking his question.
Well, Chairwoman, ranking member, thank you very much. Much appreciated. To all of our witnesses, thank you so much for your testimony today. Thanks for your advocacy and your work in terms of our forest products, our forest industry, your perspectives that can help us have both a healthy environment and a healthy economy. And so, Mr. Imbrogano, Bill, in your testimony, you discussed the impact that lower timber targets have on sawmills and the supply chain. Now, the administration has proposed reducing the Forest Service's timber targets in fiscal year 2022 budget requests from 4 billion board feet to 3.2 billion board feet. Now, what can we do to encourage the Forest Service harvest more timber system-wide and closer to each forest allowable sustainable growth or sales quantity act?
Yeah, so the administration's budget actually proposed, I think, 3.4 billion board feet, and that would represent an increase over the current year's expected output, and it would be an increase over last fiscal year. But it is down from the 4 billion board foot target that was in the prior year's budget request. The reality is on the national forest system, the timber outputs have been climbing steadily since bombing out in 2000, but we're not even close to capturing either growth or mortality. And I think one of the things I mentioned is preparing in advance to be ready when you have a disturbance event. There's portions of the national forest system that aren't going to get managed, wilderness areas, roadless areas for the most part. But on the general forest, each unit of the national forest system should be prepared to capture value and capture the carbon from damaged trees. The response in different parts of the country of the Forest Service to these events is markedly different. The national forests in Mississippi salvaged 85% of the acres that were damaged by Hurricane Katrina, whereas in the West, it's rare for a forest, say in California, where the ranking member of the subcommittee is from, to harvest, to salvage more than 5 to 15%. So 85% of what's burned is just basically converting to brush fields. So that's a big area where the Forest Service can do better and would help sustain local industry, and would have substantial carbon benefits as well.
Well, thank you for that. Markets obviously are extremely important. We have to have markets for our timber, for our board feet, in order to be able to have that demand to be able to do the healthy management of the forest, let alone support our economies. in rural America. What can Congress do to incentivize new markets for wood waste and low-grade wood? And would growing new markets for these materials benefit both forest health and hazardous fuels reduction?
That's for me. Yeah, absolutely. You know, I think whenever you've had the Forest Service in front of this committee or other committees, you know, they always talk about the difficulties they have in selling low-value trees. And, you know, I think the markets for residuals and lower value materials are critical to making the entire industry work. You know, when we saw schools and offices go virtual last year, demand for printing and writing paper evaporated. And that was already a sector that was under a lot of stress. And Henry can perhaps talk a little bit more about that. You know, but right now what we'd like to see is for the Forest Service to sustain the mills that they have, like Rex Lumber's mill in Bristol, Florida, and the remaining mills on the Black Hills. If you don't have those primary wood processors, the entire wood value chain is going to break down. It's difficult to make it go strictly on residuals and low value biomass.
And my final question for you, Bill, or anyone that would have insight on this, can anyone tell us more about the cottonwood precedent and why it is so damaging, and what can Congress do on that front?
So the cottonwood precedent was a decision out of the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals that the Obama administration challenged, and basically it's allowed environmental groups to win injunctions against timber and forest management projects while forcing the Forest Service to go back and consult with the Fish and Wildlife Service on the underlying forest plan. And it's important to understand there's no conservation benefit here because the Fish and Wildlife Service would have already signed off on the project. So there's no project level concern. And in some cases, these forest plans are over 30 years old. So Congress fixed part of that, the critical habitat designations. I believe that was in the 18 Farm Bill. But there's 3 other prongs of the cottonwood test. And as I mentioned in my testimony, 400 million feet are tied up just in Region 1. And that's, you know, putting a substantial strain on the industry in that part of the world.
Well, once again, thank you, Bill. Thank you to all of our witnesses. Madam Chair, thank you so much.
Thank you very much. And the chair now recognizes Ms. Pingree of Maine for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I really appreciate you holding this hearing. Thank you to all the witnesses. All of you really have provided excellent insights into some of the challenges that we're facing from the Forest Service to our private industry. Representing the state of Maine, we're the most forested state in the nation. We don't have a lot of Forest Service land, but we face some of the same challenges that I heard from Minnesota and some of the Midwestern states, closure of our paper mills, all the things you talk about, trucking, labor, they're all issues for us as well. I want to ask my first question to Mrs. Doucette. Thanks for telling us a little bit more about the ups and downs of your lumber mill. I'm sure this has been a really challenging couple of years with the loss of demand and then huge interest in it. And really appreciate the expansion that you're making and the jobs you provide in your area. You talked a little bit about the Forest Service Wood Innovations Grant Program in helping the industry to diversify and look into the future. I'm really interested in the innovation side, and I also chair the Interior Appropriations Committee, so we're trying to increase the funding there. But I'm working on a new bill to expand and make some improvements to that program and other Forest Service programs. Could you talk a little bit more about how in your industry they have helped or how they could be changed to benefit you?
I think any support of research, you know, research is wonderful, but those end markets being viable are very important. There's a lot out there, and we'd love some of it to get to fruition. We personally have looked into biochar as something, especially we've been impacted by Hurricane Michael, but we're not finding the markets there to support the investment, and so. And the research is critical, it's very important, but getting to that end user to where there's an industry that can be supported has to be
That's great.
available.
Yeah, thank you for saying that. And I think you're right. it's one thing to have the research, but we also have to figure out how to make sure there's a market there so it's economically viable, and that's really important. And we're hoping to add a biochar facility in Maine, so we're huge fans of that as well, but you're right, there's some challenges. Mr. McDonald, thank you for the work that you're doing and your really interesting testimony. We're sorry you're on the West Coast instead of the East Coast, but we have some great research going on in Maine as well. And you talked a little bit about the climate benefits of materials like mass timber, which is something we're really interested in exploring more in terms of the infrastructure investments that Congress is making. In Maine, we're working on some of those things as well, and including wood fiber insulation product, which we think also expands those markets. And we hope you include in some of your prototype products. But can you talk more about any thinking that you've done about how we could get the GSA or the Department of Defense or other sections of the federal government to kind of use our purchasing power to increase and better utilize these products?
Thank you for the question, Congresswoman. I'm a Canadian citizen, and there are some precedents in Canada that have worked quite well. In 2009 in British Columbia, there was something enacted called the Wood First Act, which was a piece of legislation that specifically incentivized the use of wood in buildings paid for with provincial funding. That catalyzed a lot of the early interest in mass timber. In fact, British Columbia was, I think, the first place in North America that really got going with this. And, there was no particular teeth for the legislation in terms of there being a penalty for not using wood, but the general principle was that if it could be done within the bounds of building codes and so on, then it should be done. And it really got a lot of that early work going. And as a result, in the same province of British Columbia, 52 municipalities enacted their own wood first resolutions to say, when we do build a municipal building, we'll use wood. Ontario did a similar thing in 2012. I know that in Oregon, there was a thought about doing that a couple of years, maybe 5 years ago, but there was a little bit of resistance from other industries. So I think, a low carbon building materials incentive would be something that would be palatable to a wide range of industries. There are really good innovations going on in other materials too, like concrete, as the committee's previously heard. And so that would be something I think that could really drive adoption.
Great, that's a wonderful suggestion, and I will look more into that because I think, as I think you might have suggested in your testimony, it's something we should use federal, state, and local governments to really encourage this. And it's kind of a crying shame if in states like Maine or Oregon, we don't have a wood first ordinance in our communities, because that's a great way to support it. I'm out of time. Thank you, Madam Chair. I yield back the time I don't have.
The chair now recognizes Ranking Member LaMalfa for 5 minutes.
Thank you again. Let me turn to Mr. Schinnebeck for a moment here. We, of course, are seeing the issues for the last year of trying to get the product from the woods to the shelf. What can we think about in terms of a pandemic situation like we currently are trying to come out of, or one that may happen in the future? And just as a practical matter, I got frustration out there on the front line with people saying, we're outside, we're out in the woods, we're not in large groups of people, yet there is really hesitancy to be able to do that work in a spread out situation of, on whether it was federal forest lands or even somewhat in the private sector too. What do you think we could do to improve protocols to allow people to do more outside work and not have such tight constrictions on such as COVID and not, basically people having to stay home?
I think it was really good to see that Homeland Security did recognize the timber haulers and harvesters as being essential workers. That was good, because most of our folks do work in machines by themselves. They don't, and a lot of the larger logging companies, they did do different protocol. They didn't put a whole group of 4 people in one vehicle and send them out to the woods. They, you know, some of them did different things. They might have paid gas stipends and stuff for them to take their own vehicles and separate them from that regard. Probably one of the bigger issues that we ran into was really having access to agency folks when the stay-at-home orders took place. So, you know, a timber sale goes on and you want to close the timber sale out. It was difficult from time to time to get a hold of somebody to actually close the timber sale out. There's certain requirements that are needed. You know, you have to have your roads cleaned up, you have to have different things done, and to get that approval to close that out, you know, I think that's really an improvement that could be made, is having access, better access. You know, I mean, we've all gotten more used to Zoom and those types of things, and you know, we're trying to create apps for loggers and truckers. Everybody carries a computer in their pocket now with a phone, and being able to give them access to those people.
And that's what we were running into a lot of, is ability to get the permitting done, getting the work done from the agencies to allow those folks to get out there and do that. We do need to find improvement there. Mr. Imbragamo, talked a little bit about the increasing the salvage situation. I mean, we have so much potential in the West, millions of acres, and I'll say it again, that when you fly over after, say a few years after a fire in a particular area, and you can see there's the checkerboard pattern of private land versus federal land, and you can tell which one is which just by flying over and seeing which one has been recovered, which one's been starting replant and restoration, et cetera. How the heck are we going to increase the salvage on federal lands? What do we need to do to help the federal agencies to get untracked from lawsuits, or get motivated to get this out? You know, maybe fight the lawsuits, because we're not helping our federal lands with this lack of recovery. And you know, that window of time where you can salvage trees and actually get value out of them within a year after a fire, and we lose that because of lawsuits, you know, dragging on for years and years. What do you see as one of the linchpins of being able to speed that process up and get the value and actually get them restored again for a market that still seems to want it?
Yeah, I think you've got it exactly right. The problem is right now we do fight the lawsuits, and frequently the agency prevails. So ultimately the projects go forward. The problem is that they go forward sometimes too late. If it's a proactive project, and we actually had, I think, a great example of this in your district back in 2012, where the Forest Service had tried for over 6 years to do a thinning in some land that was a spotted owl habitat, and they finally prevailed in the lawsuit, and before the project could be implemented, the project area burned. That was not good for the owls. I think that fire burned 20 or so spotted owl nesting areas. And then on the salvage side, as you said, if we don't move fast enough, you lose value fairly quickly, much more quickly in the eastern U.S. than in the West. You know, as I said, if Congress would bless the idea of pre-planning the salvage so that at least salvage outside of wilderness and roadless can go forward in an expedited fashion, that would enable us to get the fiber on a timely basis and help pay for the reforestation that we know is going to be needed.
Yeah, exactly. It seems you just keep running into, you know, one particular case in East Butte County in Northern California. There was grant money sitting there waiting to be used for fire safe council work, but they couldn't get out of their own tracks due to some combination of NEPA or CEQA. And so that grant money sat for 2 years. Finally, the area burned, and it's just a horrific story. So we need to expedite. So I yield back. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. LaMalfa. The chair now recognizes Ms. Custer of New Hampshire for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thanks so much for holding this important discussion. New Hampshire is the second most densely forested state in the entire country, and nearly 60% of all our agricultural lands are working forests. A strong conservation ethic is deeply embedded in our state's history, as is a heritage of maintaining forests that are responsibly managed. However, the forestry sector in our region, like the rest of the country, is facing serious challenges that have only been exacerbated by the uncertainties of the COVID pandemic. I was pleased to hear from foresters and loggers who were able to access Paycheck Protection Plan funds to get some relief at the height of COVID. And I was also proud to help champion $200 million in direct relief for those businesses that was signed into law in December and rolled out by the USDA just this week. I've heard from timber stakeholders in my district that this assistance is vital and cannot come soon enough. And while I'm glad we were able to work in a bipartisan way to help this industry, we must not lose sight of the long-term issues that still need to be addressed. For New Hampshire, the future of forest products has a direct correlation to the future of our rural economies and our iconic wild places. With land prices climbing rapidly and residential development increasing, the survival of our small family-owned forests depends upon having strong markets for their wood products. As New England's paper mills have largely closed over the past couple decades, it's imperative to help connect foresters with new market opportunities. So I'm excited about the tremendous progress being made to incorporate mass timber and wood products into tall building construction and other infrastructure, including, I might add, in a new building, addition to a building in the Navy Yard in our neighborhood here in DC. I've also been proud to champion legislation that provides incentives to help transition families and businesses away from fossil fuels and toward modern wood boilers and heating systems. The forest products industry desperately needs new markets like this for low-grade wood that could otherwise accumulate on the forest floor and accelerate fires. And these are just a few of the avenues that should be pursued in order to maintain and grow a healthy market for wood products. Congress can play a role in fostering this progress. Now, Mr. Schoenebeck, your testimony highlighted just how severe an impact the pandemic has had on the financial health of many businesses in the timber industry. Could you elaborate on why high demand and prices for products like lumber did not trickle down the supply chain to small business harvesters and haulers?
Sure, I'd be happy to answer that question. So it really becomes a supply and demand thing. So when you look at, I would say, especially in Wisconsin, Minnesota, Michigan, we had 3 pulp and paper mills close, and they bought a substantial amount of wood. They bought, roughly 25% of the pulpwood that was harvested in this region. And when that closes, we have a lot of loggers that are out there that are, they have a lot of equipment and stuff, and they produce a lot of wood. So when you lose that market, you have a supply and demand issue. I mean, it only makes sense if I'm going to purchase for a mill and there's just way overproduction out there, I'm not going to pay as much for that. And then on the other hand, when we saw a lot of the markets kind of curtail a little bit from purchasing because they had no idea what the pandemic was going to bring with stay-at-home orders, they basically stopped production, and these mills actually closed their production, and those markets no longer existed. But then for building material, all of a sudden it just took off. I'm not sure we knew we had that many do-it-yourselfers at home.
Yeah, it certainly. My husband's done a lot of projects, and the price goes up every week when we go back to the lumber yard. Mr. McDonald, the work that you and your colleagues are doing at the Tall Wood Design Institute is very exciting, and I'm interested in the workforce development components necessary to support mass timber and tall and intricate building construction. How long will it take to complete the certificate program you're rolling out in Oregon? And do you think this could be a model that could inspire similar programs in community colleges and schools across the country?
Thank you, Congresswoman, for the question. Yes, the work will be completed largely over the next 12 months. We're rolling out a combination of e-learning and blended learning to kind of maximize the access to manufacturers in remote communities. A lot of the work that we're doing is focusing on the digital skills that are missing. If you're a lumber manufacturing company and you start to manufacture something like mass timber, you're designing for a customized product instead of selling in high volume and low complexity. You're selling a customized building component for a specific place in a specific building. So a lot of the skills gaps are in things like computer-aided design, computer numerical control, fabrication, and that kind of thing. So we do feel it's important to partner with community colleges to really, to say, maximize the access of those programs in all of the communities where they're needed.
Great, thank you so much. My time is well over. I yield back.
The chair now recognizes Mr. Desjardins from Tennessee for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'd like to pick up where we left off a little bit on lumber prices. What I'm hearing back home from people is, they were going to build a house, they started building a house, and now the costs have gone up exponentially. And Mr. Schennebeck, you touched on this in your opening testimony. I guess the question is, these prices are high, the producers are not getting paid more, the haulers are not getting paid more. They did get some relief from PPP, and that's good. The big box lumber stores, are charging these high prices. The question I guess I would have is who's getting rich off these high lumber prices?
Well, sorry. Being a lumber producer, we are a commodity, and the prices of lumber go up and down. I will tell you, our highest average price, weekly average price, was $1,200. We are now, I am seeing $350 to $450 average price. So it has corrected, and I believe we submitted a chart showing kind of lumber prices over the last 5 or so years, and you can see the anomaly that happened in 2020 and 2021 due to the demand created by the pandemic. So demand just outpaced supply, and the prices went up in response.
But somebody was making some money somewhere, whether it's Georgia Pacific, Sierra Pacific, these companies, their stock has gone up. We saw a similar phenomenon in the beef industry. The producers couldn't sell their cattle. The packers were shut down due to COVID, but the prices we're paying in the grocery store are high. People are asking, who's making money? Is it the grocery stores? Is it the big producers? Somewhere in both these industries, it seems like down the chain, people were getting paid by the taxpayer COVID relief, but somebody is making money somewhere. And I don't believe it's the producers. I don't believe it's the haulers, but I do think there's big companies in there that, almost seems to be like price gouging we see sometimes with gasoline. Do any of you feel that that's the case?
It's a commodity market. It goes up and it goes down. So that we've lived with this. I've been in this industry for 23 years. In 2009, I was selling lumber for under $200 per thousand and losing money every day. So it's a supply and demand industry. Our country's not real used to commodity markets and the volatility they can create. But what happened was just extreme demand. Also due to depressed housing, we lost so many mills through the Great Recession, and then housing starts have been depressed for over 10 years. So we just had an undersupply of housing on top of this. So
okay, I think they're projecting, though, it's going to take 2 or 3 years to normalize. You say they've already come down tremendously, but a lot of prognosticators are disagreeing with that. But let me move on. And this one, I guess, is for anyone who wants to answer it. We've heard some talk recently of potential changes to inheritance tax, including a recent proposal from the administration discussing the possibility of eliminating the step up in basis that allows families to leave certain assets to their heirs and reduces their capital gains liability. Would anyone here be able to discuss what this would look like for the timber industry?
I can tell you what it would look like for a family business. We're a fourth generation, and I am actively trying to get this business into the fifth generation, but it takes planning on day one. The minute you have a child, you have to start planning and start gifting, because we're not cash rich. We're not a cash rich industry. We are an equipment rich industry. We have to invest a lot of money into our businesses. And so when someone passes away, you have to have a lot of life insurance, or you have to have gotten it out of your estate to maintain the business.
Let's just touch briefly on labor issues as well. Most industries, restaurants, service industries, cannot get people back to work. There's 9 million available jobs out there. How is this impacting this industry in terms of being able to get people who were laid off due to COVID back on the job?
Well, in the states we operate in, the unemployment assistance has ended. I think the last, Florida ended it at the end of June, and Alabama and Mississippi were a little bit earlier. We're starting to see people come back into the market looking for jobs. It was very tough through the last few months getting employees into the workforce. So with the reduction of that, we are seeing more people come into the workforce.
So the take home there is that if we end these additional benefits that we've been seeing around the country, then we're going to see people go back into the workforce. But as long as states continue to provide the extra $300 per week, we're going to continue to have the problem. And Madam Chair, I went over too. I'm sorry. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Desjardins. And the chair now recognizes Mr. O'Halloran for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair and Ranking Member, for putting on today's hearing. The COVID-19 pandemic placed unique challenges. I remember a number of fires talking to Forest Service people also when they were fighting fires and the challenge that was presented to them. And as we've heard today, will help us better understand the lasting effects and the identity opportunities for future economic growth. My district includes all or part of 6 national forests in addition to the Grand Canyon. We are loaded with pinyon pine. This is the largest pinyon pine forest in the world. And it's the wood products industry in my district plays a key role in forest health and wildfire risk. In cooperation with the Forest Restoration Initiative, FORFRI, the role of low-value, small-diameter ponderosa pine remains a major issue in the success of FORFRI and the establishment of a sustainable restoration economy. At one time this year, in my district, we had 14 fires going at one time, none of them over 10,000 acre-feet, or 10,000 acres. I remain hopeful that we can develop an efficient and sustainable uses for these products to reduce the fire risk in Arizona's forests. Careful forest management is critical to ensuring the safety and stability of the region and the wood products industry in Arizona. Mr. McDonald, you mentioned ways in which mass timber innovations play a role in helping with other key challenges, such as wildfires and the need for new products to reduce costs for thinning, a critical element, and reducing fuel loads in western states like Arizona. Can you describe the challenges and opportunities for creating mass timber products and using underutilized species like ponderosa pine?
Thank you, Congressman, for the question. We are doing a lot of work on ponderosa pine specifically, and what we've found is that the technical characteristics of the material are such that there's no significant barrier to their use in mass timber products. In some cases, for example, they might be used in the middle layers of a cross-laminated timber panel with stronger material on the outside, but really the strength characteristics are not as good as something like Douglas fir, but there are applications in buildings that have lower loading requirements, for example, or that kind of thing. So more of the challenge right now, I think, looking forward, is working out the logistical, the business case, the economics of the supply chain and logistics. How do you get that restoration fiber to a sawmill that can process it? It's set up to work with sometimes small diameter timber, and then to a mass timber processing facility in a way that is commercially viable. For sure, any markets we can create for this product will help to offset the cost of restoration work, which is really critical to reducing fire risk. But I think the business case, looking at logistics and transportation, is the problem that we have to work on next.
Thank you. And is there more targeted support we can provide, we, the government, or others, in the area to make a better impact?
Yeah, the Wood Innovations Program and programs like that have been very, very useful to a large range of projects, not just research, but pilot projects. There's a great example in John Day, Oregon, of the community working hand in hand with a sawmill that was experiencing basically they ran out of fiber, traditional fiber, and the community worked with them. Environmentalists worked with them and came to an understanding that it's better to use this wood to thin the forest, to save the forest basically and protect it, than to try to oppose the use of it. And so it resulted in the sawmill being able to remain open and continue to employ people in the community, and for this restoration work to happen in a commercially viable way. So I think the continuation and the continued funding for the Wood Innovations Program would be very, very useful for that kind of thing. If there are ways to provide tax incentives to those kinds of projects where you're retooling, for example, a dormant sawmill, trying to bring it back online to
we'll have to talk about it later. We're over our time. Madam Chair, I do want to say that I would hope the Forest Service starts to use the 20-year contracts that we've allowed them to use now for a couple of years. They seem to be going slow at that, getting that up to this speed, and it's critical that this be part of the process, and I yield.
Thank you, Mr. O'Halloran. The chair now recognizes Mr. Allen for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman Spanberger, and for having this hearing today. Although I tell you, we've been getting an earful from our timber industry and our home builders for quite some time, and I wish we could have gotten together earlier. But we're here, and thank you for doing this. You know, for the last half year, we've been dealing with these challenges facing our timber industry. And of course, COVID-19 gets blamed most of the time for it. The most critical issues the timber industry tells me they're facing right now are lack of labor, shipping costs combined with lack of truck drivers, low prices for uncut timber, and insufficient domestic milling capacity, and the inflation that is caused by this insufficient milling capacity. We do know, and I had noted, I think, in previous hearings as much as 2 to 3 years ago, that we're seeing a lot of consolidation in our milling industry, particularly from non-U.S. companies, and that was a concern. And so, Mr. Schimbeck, in your testimony, you highlighted the slim profit margin that timber harvesters and haulers receive. Obviously, y'all feed the milling facilities, and why haven't we investigated, why on the stump prices are depressed, and then when you get to the mill, you get these inflated prices? Do you not have safeguards in your industry to deal with something like that, or does the government have to get involved?
Well, typically, I guess I would say a lot of that gets into antitrust violations. If we'd be looking at that as a collective industry, it typically depends on supply and demand. And, being a logger myself for 32 years, I went through a lot of those challenges where, I'd buy a timber sale. I knew exactly what my costs were. It's a little bit different in our industry. It's not like going to Walmart, you pay whatever price is on the product, right? You don't go up to the cash register and say, well, I don't think this is really worth that much money, so I'm only going to pay you $10 for this pair of shoes instead of, the 15 that you're asking. So we know what our costs are. We know exactly what they are. Most of our folks are very good businessmen. But yet when we go to the mill, it's like, well, we're only going to pay you what we think we can pay you based on what we're selling our end product for. And that's kind of the way it works in our industry. So it's very difficult for a group of loggers to get together and even discuss anything like that. We just don't do it because antitrust is a very serious violation, and we treat it that way.
but you could not like demand an investigation into this, whatever the, again, I don't know who benefited from the price of lumber but obviously it came from, it wasn't the timber owners, it was not the loggers, and of course, like I said, with the mills, you know, we just had this consolidation, which is creating big, you know, in my opinion, lack of competitiveness, and I think certainly the Federal Trade Commission needs to look into that issue. Moving on to the next big disturbing piece of this whole thing to me is the forest fires, and it is amazing to me that a developed nation like the United States allows people who know nothing about our greatest resource, our timber lands, that control the management of those timber lands and allow these fires to take place. And so, Mr. Schimbeck, as a logger, can you give us your take on what it's going to, I mean, and of course, we understand this has been going on for 20, 30 years, and we're way behind in managing. Do you see a way out on this? How do we fix this, and how can we fix this problem quickly?
Well, one thing I think we need to do is support the industry that we have, and also make sure that everybody's got affordable raw material. I mean, I personally, I don't see any good reason why we should be importing a lot of the lumber products and stuff that we are when we're growing it right here in this country. We just don't have access to it a lot of times, and it needs to be affordable because we do compete globally anymore. We don't, you know, and we have other industries that we could be supporting, biofuel industry. You know, I was recently through central United States and saw, I don't know, hundreds of windmill towers. I'd rather see a growing forest there that's being harvested sustainably and having that go into energy production in biofuels or wood pellets or whatever they are. But the biomass industry just hasn't taken off because there's a lot of subsidies for other types of energy that are out there. And that industry is not included in that.
Okay.
But I think if we really support a good manufacturing base, that we will be able to, I mean, we got to have a place to go with the wood. We're growing it. We harvest it.
I'm sorry, but I'm out of time, and the chairwoman is looking at me. So, and I better yield back here. But thank you. I think you're right on, and thank you for your input, and thank you, Chairwoman, for this hearing.
Thank you very much, Mr. Allen. And I am far more comfortable tapping the gavel at my colleagues who should be looking at that timer than I am at our guests. So, but I was giving Mr. Allen an eye. Thank you very much for that very good answer to the question, Mr. Schimbeck. The chair now recognizes Mr. Panetta for 5 minutes.
Great. Thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate this opportunity, and obviously my friend Ranking Member LaMalfa as well. Mr. Schimbeck, let me follow up on that question real quick that my friend from Georgia asked in regards to not necessarily suppression of wildfires, which we're doing, unfortunately, plenty of. Not just this year, but a few years back, we've been doing that, especially out on the West Coast where I come from, there in California. You know, what about, I got to say, what about forest management? But obviously, level-headed, reasonable forest management in which we can reduce the potential for wildfires. Things like including removing dead and dying trees, using controlled burns to reduce fuel and larger fires, and removing invasive and non-native species to create habitat that's better suited for wildlife and native species. What about if we did something where if we had, reforestation projects that, would be for at least 100,000 acres? What if we did something like my Wildfire Emergency Act that authorizes $250 million to do something like this? Mr. Schimbeck, do you think projects of this nature and scope that big are needed to restore our forests that face the threats of climate change and the effects of climate change that we're seeing right now, even out here in Washington, D.C., with the haze that we're seeing from the smoke of the wildfires that are out west?
Yeah, I think that would be very helpful. I think it's a helpful tool, number one, for the agencies to be go in and do their EISs and their NEPA documents based on those larger acreages and kind of being a bit more inclusive on that. And then breaking those down into smaller, affordable timber sales that loggers and companies can afford to buy. You know, when you look at it kind of across the landscape, it's more efficient. It's economically, it just makes more sense to do it that way in those larger projects like that. You know, and I think that goes a long ways with climate change. You know, you're looking at smoke there. Well, we're getting smoke here in Rhinelander, Wisconsin from Canada right now. There's a haze on the road, and that's what the newscasters tell us that's coming from. So, you know, it's out there, and that's not healthy either. So I think that would go a long ways in helping that.
Thank you. And another bill I have called the Replant Act, which addresses the important issue of the reforestation and basically dealing with the Reforestation Trust Fund, which I'm sure you're familiar with. Right now, as you know, Mr. Schinbeck, that there is a cap at 30 million, and basically, you know, it's financed. That trust fund to reforest is financed through tariffs collected on wood products, but it's capped at 30 million. And what my bill would do, would basically take that cap off. Would you think something like that would help, obviously, one, reforestation projects, but also lead to more resilient and healthier forests?
Yeah, I mean, in today's world, 30 million is not a lot of money. Probably look pretty good in our retirement accounts, but in reality, it's not a lot of money. And I think that if you were to allow, you know, because a lot of our forests regenerate naturally, but there's a lot of it that needs to be replanting for storms, that type of thing. And for us, we've seen some of those nurseries shut down, and that really stifles their ability to research better trees that can perhaps resist emerald ash borer, oak wilt, some of those types of things. So I think that funding would go a long ways to help those nurseries develop trees that are more resilient to those types of things, which in turn would be planted and really help to sequester carbon.
And part of that is nursery capacity as well. Can you speak to the importance of shoring up the nursery capacity for these types of projects?
Yeah, it's been, you know, so we've had a few that have shut down in Wisconsin that the agency had, that the Department of Natural Resources had, and it's, you know, so far they've been and it switched a little bit. A lot of folks have been going to containerized trees, which is taking more time, and they, you know, they feel like they're better stock to plant, but having accessible and, again, affordable stock to replant is very important. So just like everything else, if you reduce the amount that's available and you reduce the places that you can get it from, transportation costs go up if you have to bring them farther. It would definitely help if there was a better, you know, more available nursery capacity.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Schoenbeck. My time's up, and I thank you, and I thank all the witnesses, and Madam Chair, thank you. I yield back. Excellent job, Abby. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The chair now recognizes Mr. Johnson from South Dakota.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My questions will be for Mr. Imbergamo, and obviously there are lots of regional differences, but I think we want to be concerned anytime you've got a forest inventory that is higher than the mill capacity. We see that in a lot of places, and frankly, in the Black Hills of South Dakota, we're concerned about getting there. We want to do what we can to protect that mill capacity, because we know that processing capacity is incredibly important from a healthy forest perspective, from a safe forest perspective, and also just making sure we're in a position to develop innovative wood products. We've got to have that capacity out there. So this really builds, sir, on some of the questions my colleagues have asked, but what should we be doing in places like the Black Hills of South Dakota to make sure that we're providing the predictability and the certainty that industry needs to make the long-term investments they're going to keep them around, because we want that capacity 10 and 20 and 30 years from now, because we want healthy forests 10 and 20 and 30 years from now?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I guess the first step is not to have a sudden and drastic decline in a timber sale program that has really done a good job of keeping the Black Hills from being entirely damaged or destroyed by the mountain pine beetle. They had a significant mountain pine beetle outbreak. The presence of those 3 mills on that forest helped the Forest Service limit its spread, and they helped capture that value, and they put that carbon into long-lasting wood products while providing jobs in small communities. And I don't need to tell you, you know these communities. The northern half of the Black Hills is overstocked and really needs both pre-commercial and commercial thinning. And in many cases, it's like a lot of forests in the West. Before you can safely prescribe burn, you have to reduce the stand density. And right now, that forest seems to have backed itself into a very bad position where it's unclear how much timber they're going to be able to get out in the next 2 years. And if that further compromises the wood value chain there, the danger of South Dakota becoming somewhat like Mr. O'Halloran's district, where you have a substantial ponderosa pine forest and just no ability to get the management done, is very, very real and very immediate. Certainly financial support to the agency to conduct NEPA, but some clear direction to use some of the authorities, again, that this committee was the author of, to get projects through the pipeline and out as timber sales as quickly as possible, is what's going to enable you to manage that northern half of the hills and avoid a repeat of the pine beetle outbreak that happened on the southern hills.
And so we want to make sure that they've got the proper staffing needed to conduct these sales, right?
Right.
Is there a role for expanded, CE authority? I mean, the last farm bill did a lot on that front, but is there room for improvement?
Sure. The 3,000 acre CEs that the Farm Bill created in 14 and then expanded their use to some other uses in 18, I think is a proven method of getting things done. The question is it equal to the challenge that we're seeing? Is 3,000 acres enough? And, I think that we're seeing again in a lot of cases that's not enough. It's not enough to get substantial projects that will keep the logging infrastructure working and feed the mills. And again, these things do not apply in the 50% of the national forest system that's in either wilderness or roadless areas. This is not about opening acres that are not available for management in current forest plans. This is about managing the portion of the landscape that we're supposed to be managing.
In the Black Hills, and I understand, the scientists, they want to have a good data-driven process, and we want them to have a good data-driven process. I have at times had concerns that when they look at the inventory, they're only looking at areas that have been historically logged. And I wonder if we could be more innovative in putting roads to some places that could be logged, that are overstocked. Am I on the right track there?
I think you are. As I understand it, the general technical report you're referring to only looked at a subset of about 700,000 acres on a 1.2 million acre national forest. And again, I believe that's just the suited base, which is in every national forest, they're supposed to identify acres that are suited for timber production. That doesn't mean that harvest is not allowed on other acres. And there are other acres that should be open to management. My understanding is the Hills is one of the best roaded forests, has a very extensive road network. So, getting to those other acres and making sure that the assumptions behind the GTR are correct is critically important. And that the existence of that report can't lead to a rapid change of direction on the forest without causing a lot of havoc locally.
Thank you very much, sir, and thank you for your indulgence, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much, Mr. Johnson. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes. And to our witnesses, thank you for a wonderful discussion. I was interested in listening to my colleagues ask their questions first because I really wanted to see where this conversation would go. It's been informative, instructive, and I think so very interesting. And as follow-up to some of what's already been asked, I'd like to begin with a question for Mr. McDonald. So as we look forward to the opportunities that exist for wood products to play a significant role in the future of America's infrastructure, you mentioned briefly in response to Ms. Pingree some of what has happened in your native Canada in terms of incentives or legislation that's helped pave the way for innovative wood products. But I was wondering if you could sort of take us back a step. You mentioned concrete, you mentioned cross-laminated timber. Could you speak just very briefly to the structural and climate benefits of using these products and why they're of such great value?
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair, for the question. I think the committee is very well informed on mass timber in general, and some of the benefits of being able to sequester carbon for in long-lived wood products like buildings, the ability to manufacture buildings with less embodied energy than other more energy-intensive materials like concrete and steel. And rapid construction, there are of course economic benefits too, but and I think there's direct links between creating markets for these kinds of wood products and keeping forests as forests.
Yep.
If you have robust demand for wood products, it's the best way to ensure that forests stay as forests.
Mr. McDonald, and certainly the concept of nanocellulose and innovations in concrete are something that's of great interest to me and something that I frankly talk about with my constituents when we look at where are some climate-friendly solutions that we can bring to the infrastructure investments that we're making in our country. So that's why I asked the question, because I think it's an important one for anyone at home watching the Conservation and Forestry subcommittee hearing to have a bit more information and background on that. And I would stop there and say from the perspectives of a sawmill operator or from the logging perspective, Mr. Scheinebeck or Ms. Doucette, is there anything you would add about where you see or where you are hopeful about the innovative wood products and new technologies that continue to be studied by people like Mr. McDonald at his university?
In the South, we have a very healthy byproducts market in Florida. Everybody's always surprised to do that, but we have paper mills and other things. But in Mississippi, it's a struggle with byproducts, and I know we've heard that repeated over and over. Alabama is okay, but anything that can come out and fill that byproducts market so that the system can be whole.
And Ms. Doucette, let me ask you a question. Is the byproducts market difficulties that you've had, is that just not generating enough interest? Is that the actual supply chain of the supply chain for the production of those byproducts? Where are the challenges that you're seeing there?
Well, it's the markets for the byproducts. So in Florida, we have paper mills. You have West Rock in Panama City. You have GP in several locations in Georgia and in Florida, and also International Paper. So we have a good market for our pulpwood, our chips. In Mississippi, we also have a pellet mill down the road that also purchases byproducts. So what it is, there in Mississippi, the markets are just very limited. And what we are doing at our Brookhaven mill, we're actually putting in a containerized dry shavings pellet plant where the pellets will be exported. And we'll be buying our own dry shavings, but we're also going to have a market for other people to sell their dry shavings to us. So we are actively looking for ways to support the byproducts market in the locations where it is struggling.
And ultimately, is that an additional revenue stream for you?
It is.
Excellent, excellent. Well, I want to thank our witnesses. I want to abide my time, and I'm going to yield back to myself and recognize Ms. Miller of Illinois. And I'm not seeing Ms. Miller on the screen, so I'm going to go to Mr. Moore of Alabama.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I appreciate you holding this hearing today. First, let me say thanks to all our witnesses for testifying in the subcommittee today. And in Alabama, we got about 23 million acres of timberland, and that's larger than a lot of states if you know about the size of some of these states. But basically, Ms. Doucette, I want to ask you a question. I appreciate, by the way, Rex Lumber investing in the 2nd Congressional District. I've heard great things about the mill. I've been to a couple of them. I want to get up and see yours, but I want to ask a specific question, if you don't mind. You outlined some obstacles to expanding your mills and facilities to heavy and prolonged regulatory burdens. And would you go into a little more detail on regulatory obstacles that stand in your way? And what can Congress do to remove the excessive red tape to help streamline practices at the federal level to assist your industry?
Well, the permitting process always takes at minimum 4 to 6 months. In the South, we are lucky. I think we generally keep it into that 4 to 6 month range. But anything that would streamline that process, and we want to protect our water and air quality, we're it's so precious to all of us. But the process is onerous. It's expensive. It requires a lot of people gathering a lot of information. And it just, anything we could do to streamline that process would help mills get started up more quickly. Did that answer? And thank you. And you're welcome anytime at the mill as well.
Thank you so much. So do you think there's are there mills on the drawing board right now in our area maybe that are coming in, you think will be coming into production anytime soon, provided we can help get the regulatory restrictions out of the way?
Yes, Mississippi has 3 greenfield mills announced. There's another one announced in Louisiana. These are all in the last, I'd say, year and a half. There are additional mills that are under construction right now. So we do have a lot of supply coming online.
Well, that's fantastic. Hopefully we can find labor. I've been critical of sending mail, checks to everybody's mailboxes. I hate it when government dollars compete against the private sector dollars for the labor force. So anyway, hopefully some of that, like you said earlier, our states are starting to clear that up. So with any luck, we'll get people back to work. But thank you, and we'll set something up. I'd look forward to coming to the mill and seeing it sometimes. Thank you. And Madam Chair, with that, I'll yield back.
Thank you.
I appreciate that efficiency, Mr. Moore. Next, I recognize Mr. Kelly of Mississippi. Nope. Mr. Kelly of Mississippi is not present at this time. And I now see Ms. Schreier has returned. So Ms. Schreier, we're going to recognize you for 5 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I want to thank you for holding this hearing. This is such a vital issue for my district, and I have a ton to talk and ask about. So I will be submitting more questions to the record about uses of wood products, the jobs the timber industry creates, and small diameter mills. Last year, a report from the Washington Department of Natural Resources identified 3 million acres of forest lands in my home state of Washington in need of restoration. A significant percentage of those acres are in central Washington, including about 700,000 acres in the Okanogan-Wenatchee National Forest in my district. A major challenge for removing fuels from overcrowded national forest lands is that central Washington has lost the sawmill and contractor infrastructure needed to make forest health treatments feasible, both economically and ecologically. And as a result, public and private landowners must truck saw logs over 150 miles away from central Washington to the nearest mills at high costs that dramatically reduce revenue. It just doesn't pencil out. Developing a small diameter sawmill in Chelan County presents a unique opportunity to create family wage jobs, make our forests more resilient to catastrophic wildfire, support the wood products industry, and reduce housing prices. Since approximately 85% of Chelan County is national forest lands, a mill would generate revenue for landowners as well as for the Okanogan-Wenatchee Forest to pay for critical forest restoration needs, including the reduction of fire risk. There is substantial momentum and desire locally and regionally to invest in this work. The effort to bring a sawmill to central Washington has the support of the community, local, state, and federal government officials, as well as environmental groups. And not only will this effort make forest restoration more cost-effective, but it'll also become profitable, benefiting state, tribal, and private lands that are currently too far from markets to be economically viable. Through active restoration and thinning, we can make our forests more resilient to drought, climate change, and pestilence, In addition, the mechanical thinning makes prescribed burns more effective and renders forests less vulnerable. So I have a question for Ms. Dosett. In your experience, what are the impediments to the development of new lumber mills on or near federal lands, and how can Congress and this committee help overcome those obstacles?
Well, we have a very personal story with the National Forest. In the South, we have a large majority of private landowners, but when my dad and grandfather sold the mill in Graceville and moved to Bristol, Florida, which is right by the Apalachicola National Forest, we were guaranteed that we would have a supply of timber for the life of the mill. So we're in 2021, that was in 1981. They did not honor that promise. And so we have been struggling with timber out of the Apalachicola National Forest since the late 90s, early 2000. With Hurricane Michael in 2018, our timber base was decimated around the mill. If you look at the path of where Bristol is, it basically wrapped around the mill. It was necessary, it's required that the National Forest step up and sell more timber out of the Apalachicola, which they have, and I'm very grateful for that. But it is the long-term solution for us to bridge the gap in that very rural community, so landowners can get their land cleaned up, replanted, and that's starting to happen as the funds have started flowing out over the last year for cleanup and replanting. So. The impediment is you just can't depend on the supply, I guess, to put it simply.
So it sounds like increasing the requirement to harvest could guarantee that supply and make a mill financially viable, make it a sure thing. Okay, thank you. I also wanted to highlight an example from my district of what can be done with wood byproducts. There's a company called Forest Concepts. It's a wood product company based in Auburn, Washington. I had the opportunity to go visit them and learn about some of the innovative ways they use wood products. One example is wood straw, which they can provide in bales, like bales of hay, but this is wood. It's their signature product. And after a fire, this innovative product can be used to prevent landslides and to promote the growth of new vegetation. And support for the wood products industry would be tremendous, both with small diameter mills and also with looking at these kind of unique products that can really help us get over forest fires afterwards. It helps everyone. So I look forward to working with the administration, Forest Service, and my colleagues on this committee to support the wood products industry, and I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank our witnesses for being with us today. Ranking Member LaMalfa and I would each like to ask an additional questions. I think we have at this point recognized all of the other members of the committee, so I'm going to yield to Mr. LaMalfa for his 5 minutes of questions. Thank you again. I appreciate, again, the line of questions. Ms. Schreier's questions are just right up the alley I was looking at, too, for Ms. Dosett. Now, can we elaborate a little bit more on, we have opportunities to use this forest biomass in not just maybe the typical way of timber, lumber products and paper products, but we're talking about the needs for the facilities to process this, and we're talking about long trucking distances, as Ms. Schreier was saying. The transportation becomes a real impediment as well. So can you elaborate a little bit more on the possibilities of having more smaller mills, or in my area where so much is on fire right now, and we're going to have so much material either left behind from a logging operation, the slash and such, or this salvaged material. We need to be converting this into electrical power. We need to make power plants. How practical would it be to have more smaller power plants spread around so that we're having the zone from which you would truck from be a little more closer, a little more reasonable? I have at least one plant in my district that runs into issues with the proximity towards the material, the forest material that would be used in the plant for making electricity. Could you elaborate a little bit on that? What we need to be focusing on? Can we have more plants, maybe a little smaller in size, to meet a better regional need?
Well, in the Sawmill, smaller is not better usually. It's usually higher volume drives down your manufacturing costs and allows you to be profitable, hopefully profitable in most scenarios. 2008, 9, 10, and 11 were not a time period where it was a difficult time period. As far as, I'll relate it to my experience after Hurricane Michael, because it's a lot of timber left on the ground. And so what our mills did is went into salvage mode, and West Rock and Georgia Pacific, all the paper mills, Enviva, the pellet mill, we all switched to just trying to salvage the timber on the ground. Now in the South, we have a life for a log about 9 months in our weather, unless you can get them underwater, which is what we were trying frantically to do. We did not have that infrastructure in place, and it's called a wet log yard. And basically you stack the logs underwater and you can store them from anywhere 18 months to 2 years, depending on the size of the log. So we were not able to do that. We do have that infrastructure in place now. Should another hurricane come in and destroy more timber, which that would be a catastrophic event for us at this point. But I do think we all need to do more planning on what can be rapid response to these devastating events. I don't know if Western logs can go under a wet log yard and be stored for a longer period. Your climate's much different from ours. We're hot and humid most of the summer, and our our logs start decaying pretty quickly if they're not preserved properly. But that's where our solution has fallen, is with these wet log yards where we can store a decent amount of timber underwater to salvage them.
You expressed frustration with the permitting process for any of these milling type facilities, and so do you think we would have a little better luck with a right sized one? You have to have your economies of scale. That makes perfect sense on a size of a mill. But is there a possibility that permitting, licensing, all those things could go easier if we're spreading them out a little bit more and sizing them a little more regionally?
Yes, and just the time, if you're going to build something new, it's just the time frame of building something new as well that hinders when you're trying to respond to a serious event.
What should Congress be doing to help this? Because we need the facilities, we need somebody. It isn't lack of material, it's not lack of wood product, and it's not lack of, I think, willing people to fall it and haul it. But what do you see? What do we could really put our finger on here?
I think if we could focus on the General Services Administration and DOD utilizing mass timber, just anything that utilizes wood in every form, and then some of these other side industries follow. But I think that's what Congress can do is support that idea of really getting mass timber out there in the market.
Thank you, Madam Chair. You bet.
Thank you very much, Mr. LaMalfa. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes for additional questions. This conversation, again, has just been fascinating, and I really thank our witnesses for your time here. I think we've heard you all loud and clear, and Ms. Doucette, Mr. McDonald, and I believe our other witnesses spoke to the need to have end users for these technologies. Ms. Doucette, I believe you said it's important to invest in the research, but we do need the end users. So I hear you loud and clear on the references to DOD and GSA in places where we can incentivize or prioritize investments in our own domestic product within the wood product industry. And I believe, Mr. McDonald, you spoke of that and included it in your written testimony as well. I'd like to ask a question related to forest management and additional wood products that, Mr. McDonald, some of it's in your written testimony and you spoke to some of it in your opening statement, mentioning the innovative projects in Oregon, where you're using underutilized species and tackling housing affordability crisis as one piece. but you also talk about how forest lands and the restoration fiber can reduce fire risks. And so could you speak to that a bit more as we see fires raging on the West Coast? We talk about forest management. What opportunity exists in our forests that could simultaneously help us mitigate and address, or at least reduce to some degree, the risk of large-scale forest fires, but also create new revenue streams, new industries, and frankly, good products from a sustainability, resiliency, and climate change perspective?
Thank you for the question. I think putting together a lot of what we've talked about already today, there are enormous opportunities to reduce, to use restoration timber. I think we still need to work on, as I say, the logistics, the economics of getting that to a processing facility. But there's a large project being put together in Oregon right now, and there's a lot of moving pieces, but essentially it's to take restoration fiber and to process that in high volumes and at low unit cost to create kit of parts housing that I kind of alluded to earlier, where we're really driving out the cost of each unit of housing by automation, using automation in the factory that would assemble these modules or these prefabricated systems. So by doing that, we kind of close the loop of reducing fire risk, using this fiber for profitable use, creating jobs in rural communities, in the mass timber facilities and the sawmills, and also creating urban jobs in prefabrication factory and designers and architects as well. So.
Thank you very much. Mr. Bergamo, you had mentioned in your statement the differences, I believe it was, between the utilization of post-disaster materials as a result of hurricanes and natural disasters in the South versus what we're seeing in areas ravaged by forest fires. Could you speak to that a bit more, and where there's areas of opportunity that we could potentially be seizing on? And what some of the hindrances might be for that real difference that we see between the two regions?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, as Caroline said, in the humid and warm South, logs don't last very long. We saw some of my member companies in the Central Rockies were conducting salvage operations 3 or 4 or even 5 years after we'd seen mortality from pine beetles. In arid climates, the wood doesn't decay quite as fast. Fire salvage, it kind of depends on where you are. The ability to capture value can extend for up to 2, maybe 3 years. The thing about salvage is that it's, again, I believe we need to do more of it. Again, this is not opening areas that are not currently available to harvest, but we do need to do more of it on the general forest landscape. But again, if the trick to attracting investment as a forest land base is to be a reliable supplier of wood fiber. And as Caroline said, we need the end use market. We also need some relative certainty of supply. And what we've seen with the Forest Service over the years in quite a number of places is they've tried to attract new investment to take advantage of to get the thinning down to prevent the need to do salvage. And then they've failed to deliver the logs that were needed to keep those investments in place. Some of my California companies, for instance, invested in small log lines when the Forest Service said they were going to move away from larger diameter material. And then those forests tried to get sales up and they weren't able to get them up. And those investments, which were substantial, wound up being just stranded assets and they had to be closed and broken up. So reliably providing a fiber supply from the general forest landscape is what's going to enable you to do the thinning, reduce the fire danger, and have the mill capacity there to get the salvage done while the wood is still viable.
Thank you very much. Before we adjourn today, I would like to invite the ranking member to share any closing comments that he may have.
Well, thank you again, Madam Chairman, for the hearing and for this opportunity to talk about something that's been a bit of a mystery for people on lumber, wood supply, and how that ties into forest management and the fire season that we can't ignore either. I think as far as solutions here, there's a lot of people on this panel that could be very helpful for us long term and in the industry to help us point in the right direction. We really just have to focus on getting out of our own tracks and having an atmosphere where the type of harvest we need, the type of processing, a streamlined process to get these products to be produced domestically, whatever it takes. And I'm so focused, in our western states in California where I'm from, that the overload of wood inventory we have to accelerate rapidly if we don't want to have this the fire situation we have year after year. And so everything has to be on the table. We have to have a permit process that gets a lot more salvage wood out a lot sooner, so we can recover the value of that. And the green harvest. And we're not talking about clear cutting every tree, and that's the fear that is often struck in media or in the environmental world there. That's not what we're after. It's not about big timber and big profit and all that. There's a responsible way to manage these lands that does take timber, but it leaves it behind too, leaves good habitat behind. We have to have everything on the table as far as the private sector helping with our federal lands, and even things on the table like being able to export more, whether it's a finished product or saw logs. We have a lot of catching up to do. So if we're ever going to catch up, we have to have open mind on how all these things can be part of the solution. And so I look forward to this conversation going forward, and again, appreciate Madam Chair's partnership on this, and I yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. LaMalfa. I would like to thank our witnesses for their testimony today. It's been incredibly helpful to hear firsthand how you all have managed the challenges of the past year, how you view the challenges of the past year and a half, and how you view the future and potential areas for us to increase our resiliency, assist the industry, and ensure that it can thrive long term. I think the conversation has moved to various different topics throughout the questions. Certainly the challenges that we see with perhaps insufficient number of sawmills, some of the challenges that sawmill operators have faced. Ms. Doucette, when you mentioned the 36 closures of sawmills across the South, that's certainly something that I have heard about from members of the Virginia Loggers Association, the challenges that creates for the larger supply chain. In Mr. McDonald's comments and in his written testimony, there's discussion of rail infrastructure investments that we could be making to help mitigate some of the supply chain constraints that we see on the in the lumber industry, and I think that's an important element of the conversation, and certainly something that I think we're all taking back as we think through additional legislation into the future. We've heard you all loud and clear in the ways that we can play a role in helping to inspire, create, and normalize the industry of innovative wood products and byproducts related to the timber industry, and certainly the job opportunities that exist, but the need for workforce training there. We are at a critical juncture. We have the ability to apply some of the lessons that we've learned from the pandemic the past year and a half, but also ensure that the steps we're taking forward as a nation as we consider investments in infrastructure and other federal investments and decisions are informed by the research, the development, and the future of the timber industry. We have the opportunity to strengthen the wood products industry as Congress considers our funding choices and our decisions related to infrastructure, how we can be climate smart in these areas as well. And I do look forward to working with all of you, as well as Ranking Member LaMalfa and my colleagues from this subcommittee into the future. Again, I thank you for your time, for all that you've provided to this important conversation, and all of the work that you do in this industry. Under the rules of the committee, the record of today's hearing will remain open for 10 calendar days to receive additional material and supplementary written responses from witnesses to any question posed by a member. The hearing of the Subcommittee on Conservation and Forestry is now adjourned.